Welcome, everyone. Nice to have everyone back in person for a change, right? All this virtual stuff is fun, but not nearly as fun as hanging out in person. I'm Mike Baglietto. I'm the director of our product marketing team here at NetBase Quid. This is a great track. We've got Ashley McCue from Memphis Tourism Board. Obviously, tourism is one of those industries, entertainment, travel, have been some of the most impacted industries in the last year and a half. But Ashley's got some great insights she's going to share with us and what they did in order to sort of, redefine brand identity using social intelligence. So please welcome Ashley McCue.
Well, thanks for having me. Excited to share this presentation with y'all. I'm with Memphis Tourism. I'm the research director there. I was brought on about 5 years ago as part of our initial strategic plan. Our leaders really felt like data was the future. They could see that wave already in progress, and they needed someone to build out our toolkit. So when I came on board, we had, I think, count 'em, one recurring tool that we could reference as far as the performance of the market. Now we have 30, right? So it's really been a comprehensive program that I've had the pleasure to build and the privilege to build for Memphis. Today I want to talk about particularly how we use NetBase Quid for our partners to define and help refine their brand identities, right? So Memphis obviously doesn't just exist as a tourism destination. We have all these amenities, all these assets, and we've really become at Memphis Tourism the leading resource for them in terms of data that can drive their strategic decisions. So we're looking at geolocation data, we're looking at social conversations, we're looking at traditional media analyses, we're looking at survey data from our Always On survey programs, and we're kind of funneling that or filtering that down to a strategy for partners like Overton Square, which we'll talk about today. Just to give you some background on Memphis Tourism, we are a destination marketing organization for Memphis and Shelby County, and our primary goal is to build our local economy through tourism. So we're looking at conventions and meetings, attracting those groups to town, major sporting events, as well as probably what you guys think of when you think of tourism, which is leisure, right? People traveling for fun. We have a lot of ways that we drive that economic change. I won't go through all of these, but we range from like sports councils, running the visitor center, training frontline employees on all the features and amenities in Memphis. We also run the I Love Memphis blog, which is really meant to boost local advocacy for travel to Memphis. We run the Convention Center and the Cannon Center, which hosts live performances. But of course, what you typically see are our ads. It looks like one got a little bit wonky there. But we do everything from promoting Black history, which we have a really rich Black history legacy in Memphis, our restaurant scene, the outdoors amenities we have, hotel deals, especially downtown, our holiday campaigns. We really have an always-on advertising strategy. But when you think of Memphis from a visitor perspective, you're probably thinking of one of these people or places. So, there's B.B. King, who got his start on Beale Street in Memphis. There's, of course, Elvis, right? Who doesn't love the King? We have the Stax Museum of American Soul Music, which is, of course, Stax Vault Records with Isaac Hayes and Booker T and the MGs and Carla Thomas. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, which also feeds into our current day mindset around how we can honor that legacy and also build on his message. We're one of the three zoos in the country that have pandas on like a completely different note. We also have one of the largest pyramids outside of Egypt, which is now home to a Bass Pro Shop. So we have everything from like quirky to family friendly to music legacy to live music. And so bringing this all together, our top 10 leisure demand generators attracted about 9 million unique visits from travelers alone in 2019. Overall, we had about 12.4 million annual visitors in 2019 who spent about $4 billion in our local economy and supported over 50,000 tourism jobs in Shelby County alone. Of course, then COVID. And so while COVID has obviously severely impacted Memphis and Shelby County, we've still outperformed the national trends. We've actually captured about 92% of 2019 hotel room night demand, which is about 8% higher than the nation as a whole. And a lot of that's due to paying attention to trends that we've located through our data. So one of the partners we've been working with recently is Overton Square. Overton Square is a kind of unique, one-of-a-kind entertainment district in Memphis that was purposely developed with that in mind. One thing that they really wanted to focus on was public art, right? So you see all these great murals, all these great installations throughout the neighborhood. Parking in that neighborhood is difficult, so they even built a parking garage to overcome that. And then they started to move in tenants. So right now there are about 27 different businesses in Overton Square. You can see that they got about 2 million unique daily visits in 2019. 85% of those visitors are from the Memphis MSA. So highly local, but also 15% visitor is a pretty large share overall. These are the 27 businesses that you see here, pretty wide range, everything from food and drink to the hotels to theaters. You can see on the next slide here that 52% of those businesses are food and drink places, right? So restaurants and bars. About 22% are venues for culture and the arts, typically performing arts. Ballet Memphis is there, Hattie Lou Theater is there, Playhouse on the Square is there. We have about 15% share of shops and boutiques, and then beauty and wellness and one hotel. So the question Overton Square came to us with was, what's the most compelling element of our visitor experience, right? If we're looking at what's driving this brand, right? Is it truly the food and drink? Is it just based on volume of businesses? Or is there something else we can tap into? So we started out looking at a variety of data sources, including geolocation data, demographic data, survey data. But really, when you think about what drives brand perception and what is an organic brand perception and where does it come from, there's really not a better source than social media listening. So we built out our topic in Boolean. We focused not on the primary terms, but actually plugging in all those handles and own channels. We focused on channels like @Overton Square, so the own channels for the businesses, hashtags that consumers might use, including abbreviations for Square, misspellings, all of that, and phrases that might come up in the conversation, including the names of the businesses, shorthand for the businesses that we knew from slang or conversations that we were finding. And then we also put all the owned channels for every business in Overton Square on the partnered tab of our converged media. So we plugged in all those owned channels so that we could filter them in and filter them out. So we could see what are the businesses saying about themselves and what are consumers saying about the businesses when those businesses are not in the room. Overall, what we wanted to do is find out what were the perceptions around Overton Square, and we always like to start with Quid Social. So the difference between Quid Social and NetBase, if you're building a theme in NetBase, you kind of have to know what you're looking for. So you have to know the keywords that exist, but if you turn to Quid Social, it's going to organically surface the most common language. So we like to start in Quid Social to identify those relationships between different themes and also conversation volume around different themes. So we started out by saying, what are the businesses talking about? What are they saying about themselves? And it turns out what they're saying about themselves is a lot about themselves, right? They aren't talking about themselves as part of this greater collective of Overton Square. You can see here that a lot of these clusters like Luna Rita's or Restaurant Iris, Bosco Square, Circuit Playhouse, Breakaway Running, all these individual stores have pretty big clusters. And they're pretty far apart. So you don't see a lot of it interwoven. And so pay attention to, remember this slide, and then when you see the next cluster, it'll make more sense. So we kind of thought maybe these businesses that are being more active on social media and presenting more mentions of themselves will actually have more earned mentions or more organic conversation happening from consumers than people who don't. I think that's an assumption a lot of us make, right? If we're more active on social, our audience will be more receptive and that'll be amplified. So based on this initial run, it seemed like shopping and boutiques would dominate the conversation because they dominated the the partnered conversation. About 26% of those conversations were around shopping. 24% were around food and drink, which you'll remember 52% of the businesses were food and drink. Here, only 24% of the social posts from owned channels were food and drink. 17% was the arts, so pretty small share there. And only 5% was live music, which was really kind of interesting for an entertainment district in Memphis because music is so intertwined with how people perceive us. So then we wanted to dive into what NetBase calls earned mentions, what we like to refer to as organic mentions, right? Because that kind of resonates better with our audience. Everybody understands organic versus paid versus owned. So forgive me if I slip up here. But what you're going to see is that a lot of these mentions are a lot closer together, right? There's a lot more connective tissue between them. Just looking at this network map at a glance, you have a few islands, like the Memphian Tribute Portfolio Hotel is an island that's not getting a lot of interaction with the other Overton Square businesses yet. It just opened in July, that's probably why. And Zebra Lounge Memphis, which is a kind of its own little audience up there. Everything else is really kind of related closely. What we found is that 31% of the organic or earned mentions were about the performing arts. That was the largest share of organic conversation, was about the performing arts. So we want to dive into that arts and culture conversation. And what we found when we looked at volume was a lot of it was driven by Ballet Memphis, which had recently relocated to the square, as well as a particular play, Kinky Boots, right, that was put on at a specific venue. However, I want you to pay attention to that brown circle, Hattie Lou Theater, and watch what happens when we look at this through the lens of engagements. You can see that Ballet Memphis stays about the same, Kinky Boots shrinks, and Hattie Lou gets huge, right? So you want to know what's driving that engagement, what's driving that conversation where people who are in this conversation are more willing to engage with Hattie Lou, which is one of the few Black repertory theaters in the country, versus something like a specific show like Kinky Boots. What we found is there's actually one local influencer, Kanji Anthony, who's one of our newscasters, who's passionate about Hattie Lou and posts about it quite a bit. And so she's driving that engagement level for Hattie Lou. So is there a way to get her to experience and appreciate the rest of the performing arts in the square? How can we tie in that local influence and amplify the rest of that? We also saw Lafayette's music room. You remember live music was only 5% of the owned mentions, but it represented 22% of the earned mentions. So clearly there's a visitor perception around live music in Overton Square as well as the performing arts. That's over 50% of the organic conversation. Here you can see with Lafayette's the subclusters, Summer Tour, Eagles Tribute. There's even Elton John there. He did not play at Lafayette's, but there is a tribute band called Almost Elton John that plays there a lot. What we found, we dove into this engagement cluster, is that a lot of it's driven by these like long tour schedules, right? So it's these different bands that are hitting up multiple bars and venues around the country, and they're mentioning Lafayette's, and they're getting good engagement from their consumers, but they aren't necessarily specific to Memphis. So these could be consumers excited for the show in Alabama or consumers excited for the show in LA. They aren't necessarily excited for the show in Memphis. So then we wanted to say, okay, we have a sense of the trends. We know what the themes are in terms of this conversation now. So let's dive into NetBase. Let's look at these organic conversations through a different lens. So we had about 2,000 mentions that came in through the Decahose, not everything, but just a sample, and about 1,300 authors. I like to start by looking at sentiment and what's driving the most sentiment. You can see here in the word cloud, actor, perfect program, great artist, excellent job. All these things about the performing arts are surfacing as key sentiment drivers, right? And if we look at what's driving the net sentiment, you can see arts and culture and food and drink both have really strong positive sentiment scores, whereas events and festivals, kids and family, nightlife, those are more neutral. It doesn't mean there aren't topics about those, there aren't comments about those themes. It just means they don't have a strong sentiment related to them. So arts and culture, maybe we didn't expect them to have such a high sentiment. Food and drink we did, right? Because that was 50% of the businesses. So then we looked at messaging efficiency around engagements. Here you can see nightlife gets the most positive and neutral engagements in that organic conversation, followed pretty quickly by arts and culture. And food and drink got substantially less engagements that were positive and neutral than arts and culture. And when we look at that from an efficiency standpoint around engagements per post, arts and culture gets about 127 engagements per post, whereas food and drink gets 84. So arts and culture is about 50% more engagements, which of course amplifies your reach and amplifies your message. So they have a higher social media efficiency around arts and culture. Finally, we wanted to say, okay, is this cohesive with the way not only consumers are talking about Overton Square, but how the media and traditional media is covering Overton Square? So we looked through Quid, which analyzes the LexisNexis news coverage, which some of you may be familiar with. And what you can see here, just at a high level, is that Ballet Memphis has the largest share of traditional media coverage. Important to note that it's not all Ballet Memphis coverage, it's basically all performing arts coverage in there. Ballet Memphis was just the most common term, right? So it's AI, it's not perfect. But they did generate the largest share of media coverage about Overton Square. Some other clusters, you can see the Memphian Hotel, which obviously are called the Memphian. They put a lot of effort into representing Memphis well in the hotel. And you can see Memphis Heritage in yellow at the heart of their cluster, right? So everything is coming back to that. So they were very pleased to see that. You can see the events guide, a lot of seasonality, a lot of weekend stuff, and the city guide with festivals, nightlife, neighborhoods. So some ways that they can tie into the larger conversations that are happening in the media there. I also like to look at traction and which of these clusters are getting the most momentum. So here you can see Ballet Memphis. New Memphis restaurants actually got the most positive coverage, 84 positive stories. Ballet Memphis got the most coverage overall, positive and neutral. Some negative stuff about closing the theater for COVID, stuff like that. But if you look at just those two clusters together that are most common, you can see here on the bottom, you'll see the number of stories published in the traditional media for each cluster. On the side, you'll see social engagements. And what you'll see is in the top right quadrant, at the highest level, getting the most media coverage and the most social engagement is the performing arts cluster. And it's sized by volume as well. And then you have the restaurants slightly trailing that. So when it comes to getting traction in the media, the performing arts cluster will be the best way to go. So overall, some key takeaways that you can kind of take back and apply if you were doing an analysis like this for your brand or for a brand that you work with is using Quid Social to test your assumptions about what that conversation might be like. Don't make assumptions about, oh, I think our audience would mention this word or that word. You may be missing an entire section of your conversation without Quid Social. You also want to take a look at social media efficiency. We all have limited time in our day, and especially for places like Overton Square or Memphis, where you maybe have one person on social media for the entire area, efficiency really matters. If you can amplify your message through engagements, that's a great way to maximize your impact. And then we also want to make sure it's cohesive, that we aren't just taking something that consumers are saying and disregarding the overall brand awareness driven by traditional media, but making sure that they align. Where do they overlap and where's the biggest potential to spread that message across the MSA and beyond? So based on all of this and based on some other data that we took from other sources, we really recommended that Overton Square reposition as an arts district. We thought it'd be compelling for visitors and especially for locals. Thank you guys so much for listening. I know that's a lot to take in, but are there any questions? Yeah.
So did you, that is kind of like diving into this data, or like, does Overton Square like do this? Like who kind of like?
So I do it. We're hiring though, so if anybody here is interested in moving to Memphis. No, I do this like ad hoc for different partners as they need it. We're typically on a 6-month reporting schedule, so they'll get something at the end of the fiscal year and something at the end of the calendar year, or more frequently if they need it, right? But the Overton Square was kind of at a critical moment of deciding how to position themselves going forward, so they solicited a comprehensive report. And so we were able to perform that for our partners, or I say we. Yeah.
Yeah, so just piggybacking on that, with the findings that you had where it was skewing high on drive better engagement? Because I'm assuming that their posts and whatnot, what they were doing.
Right, so we broke it down for the whole square, the square as a whole, right? Which was developed by one company, the Loeb Development Company. But we didn't break it down for like, here's what each individual business can do. But we did say, okay, if we're able to cohere around a certain message around the performing arts or around arts and culture, especially with all the installations, all the theaters, all the movies, right? A lot of that's gonna lift up the rest of the restaurants and bars and shops, right? Like, who doesn't wanna go out for a nice dinner before a show or a drink afterward, right? So there's a lot of opportunity there for those other businesses to tie into a central message around the square and a central brand, because a rising tide in that case will lift all ships.
So, I'm sorry, so are you, I'm assuming at some point then you'll circle back and see if in fact they did what you guys observed?
Yeah, we're actively working with them to create a strategy around that and to create ads that are being placed for visitors outside the market and kind of boosting and amplifying the square in that direction. So we're actively working on a marketing campaign now that'll launch this fall, so that they can kind of capture their winter season. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you look at the seasonality in your data? Do you analyze, like, all the data you had was really cool? I've been to Memphis, it's awesome. So many fun things to do. So do you look at specific windows of time and then report, you said every 6 months, I think?
Yeah, we generally refresh reporting on a 6-month schedule, just because I'm a team of one and there's only so much bandwidth in the day. I'm sure a lot of our partners wish they could get a live dashboard, but a lot of them don't have the team who could interpret that dashboard, right? So they kind of rely on us not only for the data, but also for the insights and the actionable strategies. I think a big piece of that is, I'm sorry, I blanked for a second.
Just the seasonality?
Yeah, seasonality. We look at that through geolocation usually, and look at like when is the most frequent, time of visit, both by day, by month, by year, right? How does this pattern fall out over the quarters? And we'll look at demographics that way as well through other sources. What's really interesting is to see that the social conversation around organic mentions also lines up with our demographic data from actual visitors, right? So we know we're tapping into the same audience that's likely to visit, which is actually a little younger than you might expect.
I'm curious if other cities also have kind of tourism boards that are engaging with data the way that you are. Are you kind of a leader in that space? Is Memphis kind of one of those cities that's known as being pretty progressive in using data?
Generally, if there's a startup, I'm one of the first people they take a shot at. There are a few programs in the United States, Las Vegas, Chicago, LA, that kind of have similar levels of being data-driven and teams that are dedicated to that. But Memphis really has, in the past 5 years, risen into the very top tier world class as far as DMOs go in terms of our data and research skill sets. Thank you, though.
I think that's all the time we have questions for in this session. Ashley, thank you so much. That was awesome.
Thank you.
If you haven't had a chance to visit Memphis, I'm going to be a walking billboard for it. It is great, lots of fun stuff.